to what degree have we seen a complete transformation of the way that wars are fought through the way that it's been fought in Ukraine? Or are we seeing just the consequence of the way the Russians and the Ukrainians fight, and NATO and others may still choose to do it if differently?
No, I think you're absolutely right, James. We're seeing a bit of everything in the war in Ukraine. We're seeing the top and bottom of it. The top of it in the highest sort of technology and the use of space and SpaceX satellites, which are really important to what's going on the ground, right down to the tanks and the armored vehicles and the trench warfare. A lot of Ukrainian soldiers have had to learn the lessons of our grandfathers and great-grandfathers in avoiding trench foot and keeping your feet clean. Any infantryman knows, as you do, that you've got to look after your feet and so on. So we've seen all of that. And in a way, I mean, we are seeing a distinctively Russian-Ukrainian conflict, but we're also seeing lots of pointers to what conflict is going to become. The way in which I think this war is most traditional is not so much in the technologies, but because this war represents the return of industrial age warfare to Europe. We thought we wouldn't see it again, certainly not in our lifetimes, although I've always thought it would come back eventually. But here we are in the earlier part of the 21st century, seeing industrial age warfare, which means that the side which will prevail in Ukraine is that which can gear up its economy and deploy all of its economic power to the front line in ways that make a strategic difference. Now, the Russians are already doing that. The Ukrainians are trying to do it, but will only succeed if we in the West are prepared to do it as well, to a quite considerable extent. So in that respect, this war is a very 20th century style war, industrial age warfare, but of course it's going to be played out with lots of the weapons and the technologies of the 21st century that you pointed to in your introduction.
Well, Hamish, you're a former tank commander. I have to be honest, in the first few weeks of the war, when Russian armoured columns were halted by small bands of determined people running out of woodblocks with shoulder-launched missiles, I was sort of much happier in my heritage as a light infantryman and wouldn't have wanted to be in a tank for love nor money. But it feels to me like once we've got beyond that initial phase of the war and it's moved out of the urban environment of the outskirts of Kyiv, we have seen that those industrial age technologies that Michael just spoke about are indeed still as relevant now as they would have been in the 80s.
Yes, no, absolutely. In fact, I'm just writing a piece at the moment for another publication called "The Tank is Dead, Long Live the Tank." But I absolutely agree with Michael's assertion that we now have a balance of mass and technology. I think in the West, we've been slightly seduced that technology is the answer. But actually, what we're seeing is that we mustn't forget about mass, whether it's massive manpower, massive tanks, massive drones. And I'm sure that we will come on to the drones. But the tank itself, the effectiveness it had in the first great tank battles at Cambrai on the 20th of November 1917, actually, we are seeing exactly the same sort of battles happening in the Donbass and Bakhmut. And when we look at the technology side of it, we've perhaps, the great Tiger tank of the Second World War, everybody, the Germans thought it was the answer, but actually it was a really good tank. It was a bit too overcomplicated and unreliable. And it was overwhelmed. The Germans only managed to make about 1,500 Tiger ones. The Germans produced 49,000, the Americans produced 49,000 Shermans. And we're sort of seeing the same sort of thing play out on the battlefields in eastern Ukraine. That yeah, sure, Challenger 2 and Leopard 2 are great tanks, are very sophisticated. But in onesies and twosies against hundreds of old Soviet tanks, it's getting overwhelmed. So I think, it's really, all's changed and nothing's new. And I think just to finish up here, the principles of air power, land power and maritime power are absolutely crucial to this. It strikes me that he who rules the skies or he who wins the drone battles is probably going to win the war.
Hamish, you commanded the British Army's Chemical, Biological, Radiological and Nuclear Regiment all the way through the wars in Iraq, the tensions in Syria and now in Ukraine. The West has been very clear that the use of such weapons will bring with it very serious repercussions. And those threats have kept the taboo largely in place. But I'd be very interested very quickly in your thoughts, Michael, first, on whether in reality NATO and Western partners need to expect a CBRN threat in any fight that we might have with a peer adversary in the near future. Michael first.
Yeah, my sense is that it's a nearer threat than we used to think of it. The taboo has broken down, and it broke down, significantly in 2013 in Syria, after which there were over 200 chemical attacks in Syria. And so that taboo is not as strong as it was. And I think we have to expect that the greater weaponization of biological and chemical elements is likely to, if not take place, at least be a danger that we've got to take more seriously, even than when Hamish was dealing with it.
Hamish, I know you will want to evangelize over the need for it, but you have the experience to tell our viewers that this is an incredibly specialized skill set. You can't just operate in a chemical environment without any prior training. So what level of effort is required from NATO to recover the skills that the army had during your day?
Well, I think there are a couple of things here. The thing about chemical weapons in particular is the psychological impact. I was the Peshmerga's chemical weapons advisor for 2 years in the fight with ISIS, and they threw chlorine at us at a regular basis. And the Peshmerga are the bravest men and women in the world, and they were terrified until they were trained and got the right kit to deal with it. So actually, it's the psychological impact that's massive. But if you know what to do and you have the right kit, actually, it's relatively easy to make it, a much less a threat. At the moment, some people might be aware. And if they're not, they might want to read my columns in the Telegraph over the last couple of weeks, because we've been doing an investigation into Ukraine. People will be astounded to hear that we've recorded over 1,000 uses of chemical weapons on the front line in Ukraine since Christmas. It is a huge issue. Now, the chemical they're using is CS gas, riot control agent. Most people, and Putin is saying it's not a chemical weapon, you use it all the time to quell riots in Europe. Well, actually, as far as the Chemical Weapons Convention, it is. I was only speaking to somebody yesterday who both in the morning and afternoon, their unit got hit with CS gas. Now, the issue with CS gas, if you don't have a gas mask, it's really unpleasant. In fact, you've got to get out of the way. So in First World War fashion, thinking back to April 1915, when the Germans first used chlorine and our troops had no gas masks, everybody got out of the trench and the Germans shot them. That's happening exactly the same on the front line in Ukraine.
For the latest in geopolitics and future episodes of Superpowers, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks for watching.